It's tabletop time. I'm Dave, and every now and then we must journey into the annals of tabletop history. Ah yes, our records. We're digital these days, it's just an SD card. About 18 months ago, I was working on a special Space Marine chapter that I hadn't got a name for yet, and thanks to your cool comments, I decided to name it The Shields of Avalon. It's time I revisit that chapter, and silly costumes and stupid voices, but mostly making the most famous wizard in history, Merlin, out of a Space Marine. Let's do it!
So I had two Primaris librarians to choose from, Chief Librarian Tigerius and the generic Primaris Librarian kit. Looking at them both, ultimately I decided to go with Librarian Tigerius as the base for this conversion. I liked the more active pose that he had, and that staff with the horned skull on the top just kept reminding me of Enchanter Tim.
There are some who call me Tim?
And for some reason, that tied it all back to Camelot, and it was just perfect. The model was fairly easy to clip and assemble, and while I cut out all the core elements and cleaned off any mold lines and sprue tags, I thought I would mention a little bit about why I'm doing Merlin. For those who haven't seen, one of the first videos we did when Tabletop Time came back was talk about the armies we were developing. And at the time, I had an unnamed force that was themed around the legend of King Arthur. I really love the knightly aesthetic of Space Marines, and I wanted to amplify this. The extremely quick rundown of the lore is basically these Space Marines are Castellans of a night world, and this world is their prime recruiting headquarters. It means a lot of the chivalric tradition and knightly legends have been passed down for centuries. This night world puts a huge amount of emphasis on the nobility of the knightly houses, with the firstborn son of every noble family to be put forward as a potential candidate for the rigorous trials to become a Space Marine, while the firstborn daughters are earmarked to be knights and pilots of the knight households. Now the secondborns, well, that's completely up for grabs. Plenty of them go on to become knights, and plenty of them serve the Space Marine chapter in various roles, with males and females alike serving in multiple roles across both groups. To set about making Tigerius, well, not an Ultramarine anymore, I focused on carving away some of the major Ultramarine symbols on his armor. There's actually still a small Ultramarine symbol in one of the purity seals on him, but as my chapter are actually descendant from the Ultramarines, this can simply be seen as a badge of honor. They defend the 500 worlds, and as such count themselves as part of the wider Ultramar Empire. Now, there are a few modifications I needed to make to my Tigerius to make him suitable as Merlin. First and foremost was cleaning off all of the Ultramarine symbols, and also giving him a more appropriate and slightly custom pose for his staff. To do this, I used the baton hand from one of the characters from the Age of Sigmar Dominion kit, cutting the top and bottom off that, and re-gluing the head and haft of Tigerius' staff onto this hand. The hand has a far more aggressive and outstretched pose, as if he's thrusting it towards something, and I think this is much more interesting in general. There was no way I was going to do without a staff on Merlin. It's Merlin, he kinda has to have a staff, which is one of the other key reasons I actually chose Tigerius. Something else that just wasn't sitting right with me was the pose of the hand held limp at the waist. There's this really awesome hand outstretched that looks like it could be casting some kind of power. Wait, that's a really good idea. Okay, so I posed the arm pointing directly forward to project some sort of power, and I'm gonna quickly run over to the computer and sculpt something up. Now, for me to really make this look different, I was going to need to do some further conversion than just a little bit of kit bashing. To do this, I got out the green stuff. I'm a bit of a beginner with green stuff, so I did my best to roll up the green stuff and get to work. There was a helpful comment in one of Murray's previous videos that suggested using a small dab of super glue to fix the green stuff before sculpting it, so I did this as I started to make Merlin's hat. Merlin's hat was absolutely a no-brainer. It's kind of absurd to think about a Space Marine wearing a pointy wizard's hat, but I couldn't make Merlin without it. So using a lot of push and pulling with the silicon sculpting tools, I just built up a brim for the hat. Then I squished together a conical part for the top, attached it with some gentle blending, and then basically just worked it back and forth until it had the feeling of an old weathered and wrinkly hat curling off to one side. With the hat somewhere I was happy with, I grabbed a big blob of green stuff and sculpted a big bushy beard.
A great big bushy beard!
Covering the space where that ultramarine symbol had been carved off on his chest. I used a sculpting tool to create some vertical lines down the center of the beard, and also made sure to press a big shape in where his mouth would be, and shape out the rough silhouette of a moustache flowing down into the beard. So in the video where I first introduced this chapter, I didn't have a name for it, and I asked for some suggestions, and there were a huge amount of them. The one I ultimately settled on, and I actually really like, is the Shields of Avalon. The slightly longer name really sounds like it fits in that sort of chivalric knightly house sort of vibe. It has a sort of a weight to it, but it also pays homage to the legend in a really obvious way. Their symbol is a kite shield with the Roman numeral D in it, which is the Roman numeral for 500, representing the 500 worlds of Ultramar that they protect. So thank you to all of the community for helping me name this chapter. So getting ready to base Merlin, I really wasn't happy with the weird forward lean that the Tigris model has, so I decided to create my own basing rock so I could lean him back a little bit more. I used some gamer's grass resin rocks to create a little stand that his 2 feet could fit on. I had to carve one down just a little bit to get the angle perfect so he was standing nice and upright. Now you'll notice here that I have a 40mm base on top of what I believe is a 60mm base, but could be a 75 or even larger. Either way, I had this clear idea that I wanted to create this display where I could remove the Merlin for gameplay on the tabletop, but have that plume of magic that I'd 3D sculpted on a separate display base that I could mount it on when he was on the shelf. Now for some reason, because my workflow is exceedingly chaotic, it was at this stage that I decided to prime Merlin black. I used an airbrush to put down some primer and then moved back onto working on the base. To get the height of the base the correct height for the insert, I used some cork board, placing Merlin on top of it and tracing around the base, then cutting it out. With this done, I could glue the cork board down onto the larger base, and there was a perfect little inset for me to put Merlin whenever he wanted. With the base to one side, I could set about getting some foundational colors down on Merlin. To do this, I airbrushed in a gradient of grays, starting with Citadel's Eshin Grey, moving up to Skaven Blight Dinge and Storm Vermin Fur for the extreme highlights. And there was just a light dusting at the end on the very zenithal of Storm Vermin Fur mixed with some Administratum Grey. So when it comes to my Shields of Avalon, we've had a lot of questions sort of asking where some of our earlier projects have gone. And I have to say, from a personal perspective, this is one of those armies that's just kind of petered out a little bit. My interest in Warhammer 40k as a game right now has waned extremely. And while the initial excitement and enthusiasm of making a Primaris force was strong, a lot of the other armies for their other game systems have drawn me in and taken away my hobby attention. The later release of Dragons for Age of Sigmar for my Stormcast Eternals, as well as extremely cool 40k releases for Chaos Space Marines, which will forever be my first love, and my embarking into a fully custom Tau army, which was the army I always wanted to do as a second option. And finally, the relaunch of Horus Heresy 2.0 completely overshadowed my interest in expanding the Shields of Avalon into a full-size army. Now that isn't to say I don't love them still, or I don't want to do stuff with them. It just means that I doubt I'll be using them as an army or regularly posting updates. This is the sort of force that's going to be really fun to create a bunch of cool character conversions, sort of to set up as a display on my shelf. I don't think I'll ever turn it into a playable force, but I do quite like the idea as creating iconic characters such as Lancelot, Galahad, and of course King Arthur himself. Now, as I'd mentioned in that original launch video, the Shields of Avalon paint scheme is grey and yellow, with a company colour making up the other part of the heraldry. For the original models that were showcased, they were, I believe, part of the 4th or 5th company. I think I said 4th but painted 5th. That is Gawain's company, and their tertiary colour is red. Now, I had previously decided that Lancelot's tertiary colour should be blue, but with it being Merlin and him being the chief librarian, he actually doesn't have a company of marines. So, as it is traditional to paint librarians blue, I decided instead to just make his tertiary colour, that is the colour of all his robes and the second half of his heraldic patterns, all of them will be blue, as an homage to the Librarius, and also the fact that Merlin should have blue robes. I mean, that just makes sense, right? So to do this, I used Vallejo's Imperial Blue and night blue, and then blended them gently up towards a magic blue on all the upper surfaces. Magic blue also seemed extremely appropriate for Merlin, so I could not go past it on the paint rack. Now there's a lot of little areas on Space Marines that are undersuits, and I painted all of these areas black. With the blue nearing completion, it was time to move on to some of the areas that would go on to be yellow. Now a really cool tip to get vibrant yellows is to undercoat them with pink, or in my case I used a magenta. Painted some horizontal stripes, as each company also has different heraldic patterns, and the pattern for Merlin is going to be a diagonal yellow slash. With these areas painted in magenta, I then blended up from a golden yellow all the way up to a bright moon yellow on the upper surfaces. Now while Merlin was drying, I went back to the base and undercoated it black. And then I set about painting the rocks on the base. To do this, I wet blended in blue, grey, a soft pink, and a brown. Roughly and wetly mixing these all over the surface of the model created a really nice natural rock texture, which all tied nicely together when I dry brushed a light grey over the top. With the rocks painted and washed, I filled out the rest of the base with a dark earth texture paste. I covered this on both the scenic base and also Merlin's base. This will form the foundation for some later flocking and shrubs, and with these two long drying steps done now, I could move back to painting Merlin. With the base drying, I got a line highlighting brush and painted on just a little bit more of that Administratum mix to the upper surfaces of the grey armor. Once I'd done the vibrant blue, I noticed the grey was looking a little bit dull and I wanted to bring a little bit more life to it. Now at this point, with a new model and a paint scheme I hadn't painted in a long time, I just bounced across the model, deciding to do a close to finished version of the beard, painting a whole bunch of salt and pepper greys across the surface of that green stuffed beard. Now on all the areas of the armor that would go on to become gold, I used a non-metallic metal technique, and as I had with the original army, I followed Emil or Squidmar's recipe, which you can check out linked up in the card here, and I recommend you all check it out. On the purity seals and also the handle of the staff, I paint Barak Nar Burgundy as a base coat. The leather areas such as the gun holster and also the wooden panels like the decorated haft of the staff, I paint in Rhinox hide. There are also areas on the model that will be a metallic silver, such as all of the long cables running along the model, and also that little device hanging from his belt. I would absolutely love to see more Arthurian models out there. So if any of you have any conversions or have made anything similar yourself, or would like to even make your own Shields of Avalon, we'd love to see them. If you could tag us in Instagram or something like that, that would be amazing. It would be super cool to see more knightly Space Marines and your own creations out there. Now I was getting close to lots of areas being finished, I decided to come back in with that moon yellow and do another highlight on the yellow areas just to make them a little bit brighter and stand out with that non-metallic metal next to them. As well as this, I painted the skull on top of the staff in a khaki color and then mixed in some greens and painted them into the shadows to give it an aged look. Then mixed back in with some bone whites and highlighted up the skull. I used the same bone whites to highlight the purity seals hanging from the waist. For the burgundy areas such as the rope on his shoulder pad and also the handle of the staff, I used Vallejo's tan and also pale skin tone, highlighting up the edges of the rope and carefully applying spot highlights on only the uppermost areas. On the purity seals, I grabbed some black paint and a very fine brush and just carefully stippled on tiny lines to represent text flowing across these purity seals. While they are called purity seals in 40k, I've been listening to a lot of Horus Heresy, and I prefer to think of them now as oaths of moment. These aren't fervent prayers or seals to signify some religious significance, but pledges to Merlin's allies and the king or chapter master Arthur himself. Nearing the end of the actual paint job of Merlin, I grabbed all my blues and finished off the non-metallic metal silver areas, highlighting up to a white point highlight and coming in black lining to give a nice amount of contrast. For the wood and the leather components, I used some Mornfang brown and highlighted up all those little wrinkly crests on that leather glove. The final step for finishing off Merlin himself, not his base or his little cast explosion, is to do a little bit of freehand weathering. On the left shoulder pad, I freehand in that kite shield and Roman numeral D symbol for the Shields of Avalon. And as a final thing, I wanted to add a little bit of etheric energy. So I used an airbrush to spray his hand, but I was pretty delicate with this. I didn't want to be overpowering, with some green and then up to a bright white. With those done, I could move on to painting his base and finishing up that special effect for his scenic diorama. Alright, so I had been fairly disappointed with how the transparent resin had come out. It wasn't really transparent anymore, so I just gave up on that concept and decided to just spray acrylics and treat it just like a solid object. I went for a green gradient because I was sick of seeing blue energy. There's no other real reason, I just thought it would be neat. And green is usually a protective color, so shields, healing, it made sense. I spray painted on various greens to bring it up to a lighter point towards the ripples, and then sprayed a little bit of Warg flesh contrast into the deeper areas between those ridges, just to give a little bit of color gradient across the whole energy thing. Altogether, it turns out it just looks like a portal from Rick and Morty. Mixing in some whites, I wasn't quite happy with the punch, so I decided to come in with a brush and just accentuate some of the areas, including some last minute touches on Merlin's hand. To sort out the basing, I just put on some flocks, as well as a bunch of tufts and flowers to match the other Shields of Avalon I've done. These are from Gamer's Grass. With these core components done, there was one last little piece to paint, and that was the explosion that was impacting the front of the shield. I painted this in magenta to make sure my yellows would be nice and bright. Then using a bright white mixed with yellow, moving out through orange to red and then a mix of grey and red to create a smoky colour, I basically just wet blended a series of colour gradients onto this explosion, keeping the bright colours towards the innermost parts of the cloud and then painting out towards the edges, getting darker and darker. For contrast, I painted the little bits of shrapnel in the explosion just matte black. And when this was done, I airbrushed on some orange and red to the center of the green portal, as if the explosion was imparting some of its energy into the shield itself. I even called it a portal just then because it looks so much like those Rick and Morty portals. So to help blend in the explosion to the shield, I airbrushed on some yellows and oranges to the center where the explosion was making contact with the shield, as if it was imparting some of its kinetic energy into that energy barrier. With this done, it was time to glue on the explosion and put it all together. We're ready to take a look at Merlin. Thank you to all of our amazing patrons for all your support and allowing us to make these videos. It's been really cool revisiting the Shields of Avalon, and I hope you've enjoyed the journey with me. If there is anything else you would love to see, why don't you consider supporting us on Patreon and coming on to our patron exclusive Discord. We're always listening to any of your suggestions there and would love to make some more stuff that you all want to see.
Oh, yes, it says right here. Everyone's favorite part of Tabletop Time is the stupid characters that Dave does for no reason, except for his own amusement. Well, isn't that just the moral of the hobby? Doing things for no reason other than your own amusement. And your amusement. If you like this video, press like and subscribe. If you don't ever want me to pretend to be Merlin again, also press like and subscribe. Yeah, that's right, baby. I want to be confused and not know what you want. So I keep doing nonsense like this. Either way, it was a pretty cool build. Thanks for watching. If you've got ideas for more characters, or you want to see the Shields of Avalon more, or you're willing for me to let this one die, so I can go back to doing Horus Heresy, well, you just let us know in the comments. There's nothing, not one page of this book has anything on it. It's all a lie. Everything you see is a lie. I'm 4'2".